So far, writing our JSX has been very similar to writing regular HTML, but there are a few caveats worth noting about JSX, and we're going to discover one of them in this lesson. So imagine we wanted to apply two classes to our anchor tag. Let's say we wanted to apply an arbitrary class of link and an arbitrary class of fancy. In regular HTML, you would simply add a class right here, and then provide the two classes, in this case, link and fancy. As it turns out, when you're working with JSX, class is actually not permitted, and we have to replace it with a special replacement, and that is going to be class name, like so. All right, so what we have right now is totally valid syntax. Remember, JSX looks a lot like HTML and is designed to function almost identically to it, but it is fundamentally JavaScript under the hood. And this is one of those cases where the original implementation of React didn't actually support class, and the replacement for it was className. Now, the original reason why the React team built it this way is because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So remember, in ES 2015, or ES6 alternatively, we introduced this syntax for making a class, and this is just syntactic sugar over JavaScript's prototypal-based inheritance. And the problem is, remember that this code under the hood, this JSX, is being translated or transpiled to regular JavaScript. Well, as it turns out, when class was being used, that was creating issues with the transpiler because it's a built-in JavaScript keyword, right? So that's why we have to use class name right here. Now, as it turns out, over time, the transpilers got much better and much more intelligent, and the programmers who wrote them added a whole bunch of additional functionality. And as it turns out, you can actually use class today legally and get away with it, and the code will still work in your browser. However, the class name attribute name is still recommended by the React team, and you'll still see an error in your browser if you use class instead of class name. So if you forget, and that is likely to happen because we're used to writing CSS and HTML like this, and so it might be a little bit of a mental shift to remember, hey, when I'm in React and React only, when I'm using JSX, I have to swap every class with class name. But the good thing is your browser console will tell you that class is not really recommended and you should switch it to class name. And the reason I think they maintain this name of class name, even though they can now support class, is number one, to maintain compatibility with older React code, but more importantly, to have relative similarity with the browser's native DOM API. So we'll talk more about this later in the course, but remember that JavaScript originated in the browser, and we can use regular plain JavaScript to interact with our browser's UI elements. And the DOM is essentially a JavaScript object representation of the elements on our page. And we can query for certain elements on the DOM, such as a paragraph or an unordered list. And then we can get a JavaScript object representation of that visual element on our page. As it turns out, web browsers on these DOM nodes that represent these visual UI chunks, or elements to be more specific, on those DOM nodes, they have a built-in object property called class name. And that's the way it's been in the browser for pretty much decades now. So the React team was also honoring the kind of traditional naming structure in the browser, because a React element, which is basically what this thing is, it's essentially just a React object representing an eventual hyperlink. They're trying to maintain consistency with a DOM node in the browser, because a React element is kind of intended to be a replacement for a browser element. It's a JavaScript object that represents some bit of user interface that will eventually become part of the UI, and it needs to keep track of properties such as the classes that should be attached, such as things like target and rel, and all those kinds of attributes that need to be added when the element becomes part of the actual interface. And so to maintain consistency with the browser's way of naming things, that's another reason why the React team went with class name. If all of that is a little bit too under the hood and a little bit too complex, don't worry about it. The only thing you really have to remember when you're starting out with React is whenever you want to give a class to an element, you have to replace the class attribute with class name, lowercase c, capital N, and then it works the exact same way as it does in regular HTML. So in this example, we assign two classes to our hyperlink. One is the link class and one is the fancy class. All right, that's all there's to cover in this lesson. So I will see you in the next one.